I want to get the boring stuff out of the way first, because I think it matters. I'm not a UFO person. I never have been. I'm 34. I do IT support for a school district up in Jefferson County, and the only reason I was out at Point Wilson that night at all is a hobby I've had for about 3 years now: night photography. Milky Way shots, star trails, the occasional meteor shower if I can talk myself into staying up for it. I've got a star tracker mount, two camera bodies, and a wide, fast lens that cost more than I want to admit out loud. There's a folder on my hard drive with something like 4,000 mostly mediocre photos of the sky to show for all of it, and I bring that up only so you understand I've spent a lot of nights alone in the dark looking up, and nothing like this had ever happened before. Fort Worden is one of my regular spots. If you've never been, it's an old coastal artillery fort out on the tip of the Quimper Peninsula, right where the Strait of Juan de Fuca opens up into Admiralty Inlet. There's a lighthouse at Point Wilson, a row of old concrete gun batteries cut into the bluff that the Army abandoned decades ago, and on a clear, moonless night, it's about as dark as you're going to find within an hour of an actual town. The vehicle gates lock at dusk, but the beach itself is public tideland below the high water mark. So if you don't mind a 15-minute walk in the dark with a tripod over your shoulder, you can still get down there. I've made that walk probably 40 times. That night was about 14 months ago now, the last week of September. My friend Marcus usually comes out with me. It's nicer not to be the only person standing in the dark at midnight. But he'd bailed that afternoon for a work thing, and I went anyway, because I'd already checked the tide tables, and low tide that night gave me a good 4 hours of flat gravel beach before the water pushed up against the bluff. Clear sky, no moon until almost 4 in the morning, water flat as a sheet of glass. I parked at the lot above the old hospital building, walked the trail down through the dune grass, and set up just past the lighthouse, framing on the galactic core as it dropped toward the Olympic peaks. Started running 30-second exposures a little after 11. I should explain something, because it matters for what comes next. If you live anywhere around the Salish Sea, you get used to strange lights at night, and you learn fast not to panic about them. Whidbey Island, right across the water from where I was standing, is home to Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, and the EA-18G growlers that fly out of there do night training that can put a light in a flight pattern no sane civilian aircraft would ever fly. Hovering turns, sudden altitude changes, the whole thing. There's a Facebook group with about 6,000 members in it dedicated entirely to what was that light over the water last night, and 90% of the answers in there are some version of growlers again. I've posted in that group myself, twice, both times to be told, gently, that I'd seen a jet. So when I caught a single light low over the water around 1:45, hanging maybe a couple 100 feet up, my first thought wasn't anything exotic. It was, growler doing touch and goes. Give it a second, it'll bank, and you'll hear the engine note catch up to the visual a second later, the way light always beats sound. It didn't bank. It just sat there. I watched it through the viewfinder for a solid minute, waiting for the engine sound that never arrived. No noise at all. And out on that point, sound carries a long way over flat water. You can sometimes hear a ferry horn from 3 miles off. I pulled the little compact binoculars I keep in my camera bag and got a better look, expecting strobes, the FAA mandated blink pattern every aircraft is required to run. There was no blink, just a continuous, steady, slightly warm white glow, the kind of light that doesn't flicker even a little, the way a flame does or an old bulb does. I told myself it was a boat running a spotlight off the Whidbey side, even though there was no visible hull underneath it, no horizon line where a deck should have been. I went back to my exposure. 30 seconds, click, chimp the frame on the back of the camera like I've done 10,000 times before, and the light wasn't where I'd last seen it. It had moved, not drifted, jumped, to a spot maybe 60 degrees across the sky, and there was no trail connecting the two positions. If a plane or a satellite moves during a 30-second exposure, you get a streak, a thin line of light dragged across the frame as the sensor records its path. Stars do the same thing on a slower scale. What I had was two completely separate, perfectly sharp points of light in two completely different places, with nothing at all in between. Like it had been picked up and set down somewhere else while I wasn't looking. That's the moment my stomach did the thing where it drops and just doesn't come back up. I checked my phone out of reflex, the way you do when something's wrong and you want to call someone. No signal. There's a dead zone right around the point that I'd run into before and never thought twice about. I thought about it that night. Two more lights joined the first one inside of maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and the three of them settled into a loose triangle, slow rotating against the dark, maybe 1,000 feet up, maybe much lower. Distance is genuinely brutal to judge over open water at night, and I'd rather tell you that honestly than pretend I had some clean, confident read on it. The light wind that had been pushing a steady 5 knots off the strait all evening just stopped. Completely. All at once. The way it sometimes does for a few seconds before a gust, except it didn't pick back up. I remember noticing the gulls that nest along the bluff had gone dead silent, and thinking that was strange before I let myself think about why. Behind me, the lighthouse beam, which sweeps a 15-second rotation like it has for over a century, caught a stutter, paused half a beat at the top of its arc, the way a record skips, then resumed like nothing had happened. I kept shooting. I genuinely don't know why. Some mix of disbelief and 3 years of training myself to record first and process the fear afterward on the couch with the lights on. The next 2 frames, when I finally looked at them weeks later with a steadier head, both show heavy motion blur smeared diagonally across the whole image. Even though I was locked to a tracking mount and the shutter speed should have frozen everything in the frame, stars included, like the air itself had moved. Then there's a flash. Not lightning. It came from directly above the triangle, one single pulse of white that didn't throw a shadow the way real light does, didn't seem to come from a direction at all. It was just suddenly everywhere at once, and then gone. My ears started ringing immediately, a high, even tone, the same one I still get now sometimes, usually late at night when everything else goes quiet. There was a taste like wet pennies in the back of my throat. That's the last clean thing I remember. The flash, the ringing, the metal taste, and underneath all of it a feeling like the bottom dropping out from under me. The way your stomach goes on the crest of a roller coaster, except it never leveled back out. There are pieces after that. Not memories exactly, more like still frames with no order to them. No way to be sure I'm not inventing the order I'm putting them in now. A low hum I felt in my back teeth more than heard. Cold air against bare skin in a way that made me wonder later whether I'd had my jacket on, though I was wearing it when I came back to myself. A sense of being looked at, not seen, looked at, examined, the way you'd look at something on a table, that I can't make sound less ridiculous than it is, and I've stopped trying. The next thing I'm actually sure of, the next thing that comes with a clear, continuous sense of having been there for it, is standing at my truck. My gear was already packed. Tripod folded and strapped down exactly the way I always do it, like my hands had gone through every step without me being inside them. The sky had gone gray. Not pre-dawn gray. Full daylight gray, gulls calling again. The tide already most of the way back in against the bluff where I'd been standing on bare gravel a few hours before. I checked my phone before I checked anything else. 4:02 a.m. The flash, by my best estimate, happened around 11:55 the night before. 4 hours. Gone. Not slept through, not a blackout from drinking because I hadn't had a drop. I was standing upright, keys already in my hand, mid-motion toward the driver's door, with absolutely no sense of any of the time in between having passed. There was dried blood under my nose that I hadn't felt start. And on the inside of my left forearm, 3 small red marks, perfectly evenly spaced, forming a near flawless triangle, already starting to blister faintly at the edges, almost like a sunburn, but deeper, with an itch that didn't sit on the surface of the skin the way a normal itch does. It sat underneath it, somewhere I couldn't reach to scratch. When I got home and pulled the memory card, The frame numbers were sequential. No gap the camera flagged, no corrupted files, nothing an error message would ever catch. Just roughly 480 completely black frames shot in an unbroken 30-second interval from 11:54 p.m. straight through to 4:01 a.m. As if the shutter had kept firing the entire time, on a lens cap I have no memory of putting on, in the dark, for 4 hours, alone on a beach. I told 2 people back then. My sister, who's had the grace never to bring it up again, which I think she understands I need, and the woman I was seeing at the time, who is not anymore. She thought I was hiding something, using something more specifically. And honestly, looking back at how I must have sounded trying to explain a sunrise I couldn't account for, I don't fully blame her for landing there. What I haven't told anyone until tonight is what's happened since. The marks on my arm faded, mostly, but there's still a faint pale triangle there if the light catches it right, and a dermatologist had no real explanation beyond could be a number of things, delivered in the tone doctors use when they'd rather move on. The ringing in my left ear never fully went away. An audiologist confirmed mild tinnitus, found nothing structurally wrong to explain it, and suggested a white noise machine. And maybe 4 or 5 times over the past year, I've come back to myself somewhere with no memory of the last several minutes. Once at my desk at work, the cursor blinking on an email I apparently never finished. Once in the shower, water gone cold around me. 2 months ago, standing in my kitchen, watching the coffee maker's warming plate shut itself off the way it does 10 minutes after the brew cycle ends, with absolutely no memory of having pressed the button that started it. I've started keeping a running log and a notes app just to track when it happens, because I no longer trust myself to remember on my own that it did. I sleep with a small light on now, which is a strange thing to admit for someone who used to drive an hour out of his way, chasing total darkness. I haven't been back to Point Wilson since that night. I've driven past the turnoff twice and kept going both times, hands tight on the wheel until the lighthouse disappeared from the mirror. The reason I'm finally writing this down is that about 3 weeks ago, someone in that same Whidbey Lights Facebook group I mentioned posted asking if anyone else had a camera glitch out near Port Townsend. A dead, calm night, the gulls going silent, a gap in their shot sequence they couldn't account for. Nobody in the thread connected it to anything bigger. I almost didn't either. But I recognized the shape of it immediately, in a way that made my hands go cold over the keyboard before I'd even finished reading. If you've ever stood out at Point Wilson at night and had your gear do something it shouldn't, or felt that particular kind of dead, wind-stopped quiet settle in right before something happened, I'd really like to hear about it down below. I'm not looking for anyone to talk me out of what I remember. I'd just like to stop being the only one who's noticed. This happened almost 7 years ago now, on the Olympic coast, and until pretty recently I'd more or less filed it away as one of those things you decide not to think about too hard. I'm telling it now because something happened a few weeks ago that made me realize I might not be the only person it's ever happened to, and that changes things for me. Back then I was 26, and my friend Dane and I had decided to hike the South Coast wilderness stretch of Olympic National Park, the 17 miles or so of beach between Third Beach, up by La Push, and the Oil City trailhead to the south. It was Dane's first real backpacking trip. I'd done a handful by then and talked him into it over a few beers, and to his credit, he trained for it harder than I did. We picked up our wilderness permit and rented a bear canister from the Wilderness Information Center and spent an embarrassing amount of time the week before poring over tide tables, because that stretch of coast isn't optional about it. There are headland points you genuinely cannot get past, except within an hour or two of low tide, and a couple of them you bypass on fixed ropes bolted into the rock instead of walking the beach at all. You carry a paper tide chart because your phone is a brick out there for days at a time, no signal, no way to call anyone for anything. We did the first night up near Taylor Point, which was its own kind of beautiful and exhausting, and on the second day we made the 3 miles down to Mosquito Creek, which sits on a wooded bluff above the beach, looking out at a scatter of sea stacks standing just offshore. There's a flat, driftwood-sheltered clearing up there big enough for a couple of tents, An old stone fire ring, a half-open outhouse that's somehow more pleasant than it sounds, and the creek itself, which you ford at its mouth and which runs the color of weak tea from all the tannins in the soil upstream. You filter your water and try not to think too hard about the color. Bald eagles worked the tide line all afternoon while we set up camp. And for a while, it felt like the kind of trip you take so you can tell people about it for years afterward. We'd actually planned the dates around the full moon on purpose, partly because a full moon means the most extreme minus tides of the month, which would open up more beach to walk and more tide pools to dig through than we'd get otherwise, and partly because, honestly, the idea of camping on an open Pacific beach under a full moon sounded incredible. It was. The sky cleared right around sunset, which apparently doesn't happen as often as you'd hope out there, and by the time we'd eaten and built the fire up, the whole beach below camp had gone silver, the sea stacks standing out black against the water like they'd been cut out with scissors. Dane wanted to go back down and work the tide pools at the base of the bluff while the moon was still high enough to see by, since low tide that night fell conveniently close to 10 instead of 3 in the morning, the way it does some nights. I grabbed my headlamp out of habit and didn't bother turning it on, and we picked our way down the use trail from camp to the sand, the same narrow gap through the salal and shore pine we'd already used twice that day. The tide pools were good that night, anemones, hermit crabs, one absurdly large sculpin that Dane kept trying to coax into the open with the edge of a mussel shell. But I remember, even before anything happened, a small, nagging feeling that the pools were quieter than they'd been that afternoon. Fewer crabs scuttling for cover when our shadows crossed the water, like something had already cleared them out earlier and they hadn't fully come back. I mentioned it to Dane. He laughed and said I was finding things to be nervous about because it was dark, which, in fairness, was a completely reasonable read of the situation up until that point. We'd been crouched there maybe 20 minutes when Dane stood up too fast and said my name in a voice I'd never heard him use before, in all the years I'd known him. I followed where he was looking, out past the nearest sea stack, maybe 80 yards offshore, where something had broken the surface of the water. My first thought, genuinely, was seal. We'd watched harbor seals all along that coast, curious dark heads popping up to study us as we walked. But seals surface, look around, and go back under within a few seconds. This didn't do that. It stayed up, low and steady in the water, moving straight toward the beach with a smoothness that didn't match anything I'd ever seen swim. No real splash, no visible stroke of a flipper or limb, just a slow, even glide, the way something looks when it's being pulled along on a wire just beneath the surface. It reached the shallows, where the moonlight hit the wet sand bright enough to see clearly, and it started to stand. Dane didn't say anything else. He just grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark I still had the next afternoon. It was tall, taller than either of us by a wide margin, taller than anything pulling itself out of an ocean has any business being. And the proportions of it were wrong in a way I still can't describe without it sounding like I'm exaggerating for effect, which I promise I'm not trying to do. Long ropes of kelp hung off it everywhere, draped over what should have been a head and shoulders, and I was almost grateful for that, because it meant I never got a clear look at anything underneath. There was a smell that reached us a few seconds later on the light onshore breeze, brine, and something underneath the brine that was closer to rot. The sound of water sloughing off it as it straightened up was wrong too. Too heavy, like it was shedding more weight than its size should have been holding. The way it crossed the open sand when it finally started moving wasn't a normal walking gait. There was a hitch to it, an extra beat somewhere in the rhythm that my eyes kept trying to smooth into something familiar and never quite managed. It didn't come toward us. We were down low behind a fallen log near the tide pools, maybe 60 yards from where it had come ashore, and either it never registered we were there, or it simply didn't care. It crossed the beach at an unhurried, almost bored pace, water still running off it and catching the moonlight, heading straight for the headland on the north end of the beach, straight for the use trail. Our use trail. The exact gap in the brush Dane and I had walked through 20 minutes earlier on a direct line up to our tent. We didn't move again until it had gone all the way up the trail and the tree line had swallowed it whole. Then we ran, low and as quiet as two genuinely terrified people can manage, back along the sand toward camp, both of us thinking the same unspoken thing, that whatever had just walked up that trail was now somewhere between us and everything we owned. We didn't take the used trail back. We cut wide around the south side of the bluff instead, through brush that tore at both of us hard enough to draw blood on my forearms, and came up on camp from an angle that let us see the tent before we committed to approaching it. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. Fire still smoldering low, nothing disturbed. That didn't make either of us feel better. If anything, it felt worse, like whatever had gone up that trail had simply passed through on its way to somewhere else, with no particular interest in two backpackers at all, which was somehow a colder thought than the alternative. We sat with our backs against a driftwood log, headlamps off, fire built up as high as we dared without making noise gathering more wood, and watched the tree line until the sky started going gray. At one point, maybe 2 a.m, we both went rigid at the sound of something moving through the brush off to our left. Slow, deliberate, then nothing, then gone, and neither of us ever found out what it had been, then or since. We didn't sleep. We mostly just confirmed every so often, in a whisper, that the other one had seen what we'd both seen. The way you check a fact you already know is true, because saying it out loud is the only thing keeping it real. In the morning, with actual daylight to see by, we found a stretch of flattened salal at the mouth of the use trail, about a foot wide, the kind of crushed, matted vegetation you get from something heavy passing through low brush, rather than from a person walking upright through it. There was no other sign. No tracks the sand had held onto overnight. Nothing the tide hadn't already smoothed away by sunrise. Just that one patch of broken brush, and the two of us standing over it not saying much of anything. We packed up early. We'd planned 3 more days on that stretch of coast, all the way down past Oil City, and instead we hiked straight back out to Third Beach in one long, miserable push, barely stopping, watching the tree line the entire way. Dane has never gone backpacking again, not once in almost 7 years, and we've never really talked about why beyond a kind of mutual unspoken agreement that we don't have to. I still hike that coast. I love it, genuinely. But I haven't camped on an open beach during a full moon since, and for a long time I told myself that had been a choice about scheduling and nothing more. For years, I worked hard at convincing myself it had probably been a sea lion, seen badly, at a bad distance, in moonlight that plays tricks on everyone. I'd nearly talked myself all the way into that version of the story. A couple of years ago, on a totally unrelated trip to a different trailhead further north, I ended up chatting with a backcountry ranger while picking up a permit. And at some point, half joking, I asked if people ever reported anything strange along that South Coast stretch. He got quiet for a second in a way that didn't match the rest of the easy conversation we'd been having. Said something like, "You hear things. Mostly around the full moon. Mostly people who don't want it written up officially." And then changed the subject before I could ask anything else. I didn't push. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Then about a month ago, scrolling through an Olympic backcountry hiking forum out of old habit, I came across a trip report from someone who'd camped at Mosquito Creek this past spring, also during a full moon, describing, almost word for word, without ever quite using the language I'd have used myself, something coming up out of the water near the sea stacks and crossing the beach toward the trees. They hadn't gotten close enough to see much detail. They didn't need to. I recognized the shape of what they were describing before I'd finished the second sentence, and I sat there for a long time afterward without typing a reply. I'm not posting this to convince anyone of what it actually was, because I don't fully know, and I've stopped trying to decide for myself. I just don't think Dane and I were the only 2 people who've watched something come up out of that water on a full moon and walk into those trees like it had somewhere specific to be. If you've hiked that stretch of coast, and you've got a story that rhymes with mine, even a little, I'd genuinely like to hear it. And if you're planning a trip down there around a full moon, just maybe stay up off the open sand once the tide pools are done for the night. I've rented a lot of places off Airbnb over the years. Cabins, a houseboat once, a genuinely terrible yurt outside Leavenworth, and I've never once read the house rules section closely before booking, because it's always the same handful of things. No smoking, no parties, check out by 11. I bring this up because the place I'm about to describe is the first and only listing that's ever made me actually read every word of that section twice, and I still booked it anyway, because it was cheap, it was the off-season, and I wanted 4 days completely alone on the water to get some writing done without anyone bothering me. The listing was a small gray-shingled cottage outside Coupeville, on the west side of Whidbey Island, the kind of place that's been a working waterfront property for longer than anyone currently alive remembers. Old pilings out front from a dock that's clearly been rebuilt more than once, a view straight out over the cove. It slept two, had a wood stove, decent Wi-Fi, and a rate that was almost suspiciously low for a place with that view in January. Self-check-in, lockbox code, no host on site. Exactly what I wanted. The rules were taped inside the cabinet above the stove, laminated, clearly something every guest was meant to find on their first night making coffee. 6 of them, numbered, in a slightly old-fashioned font, like they'd been typed up years before anyone thought to make them a PDF. Keep the porch light on every night from dusk until sunrise, every season, no exceptions. The curtains in the back bedroom and the living room, the ones facing the water, must be closed by 9 o'clock and not reopened until morning. Leave a full glass of water on the kitchen windowsill every night before bed. Empty it in the morning. Do not drink from it. If you hear knocking at the back door, the one facing the dock, do not answer it. The front door is always safe to open. Do not walk down to the dock alone after dark for any reason. If the hallway smoke detector chirps twice in a row, not the slow, single, low-battery chirp, but 2 chirps close together, leave the house immediately, go to your car, and call the number on the fridge. I took a photo of the laminated card and texted it to a friend with about 4 laughing emojis, said something like, "LOL, look at this Airbnb, it's giving haunted lighthouse keeper," and settled in for what I figured would be a quiet, slightly quirky 4 days. I want to be clear that my honest first reaction was charm, not dread. Old waterfront properties get this kind of thing sometimes. A previous owner's superstition that gets passed down with the house out of habit, the same way some people won't let you whistle indoors or put new shoes on a table. I followed the rules that first night mostly because I thought it would be funny to tell people I had, not because I believed any of it mattered. Night 1, nothing happened. I left the porch light on, closed the back bedroom and living room curtains a little after 9 out of sheer compliance as a bit. Left a glass of water on the windowsill and slept better than I had in weeks, lulled by the sound of small waves against the pilings. Night 2 is when it stopped being funny. A little after 1 in the morning, I woke to a single knock at the back door. Not frantic, not loud, just one solid, deliberate knock, the kind a person makes when they expect you to be awake enough to hear it the first time. I lay there for a long minute, remembering Rule 4, telling myself it was a branch, a raccoon, the wind doing something with the dock ladder. I did not go answer it. What I did do, because the rule never said anything about windows, was get up and look out through the small window over the kitchen sink, which faces roughly toward the dock at an angle. In the spill of the porch light, I could just make out a shape standing at the very end of the dock, soaking wet from head to foot, not moving at all. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds before I made myself step back from the window, and when I worked up the nerve to look again a minute later, it was gone. I left the water glass exactly where it was supposed to be that night, and did not touch it. Night 3. I broke a rule, and I want to be honest that it was a small, almost accidental one. I was changing for bed around 20 past 9 and hadn't closed the back bedroom curtain yet, and as I reached for it, I looked out at the water first, the way you do without thinking. Something was out past the dock pilings, low in the water, close enough to make out 2 pale points just above the surface that I understood, after a horrible half-second, were eyes, watching the house at exactly the height a person's head would be if they were standing chest-deep in cold water in January. It held still for a long beat, long enough that I started to doubt myself, and then it went under without so much as a ripple, the way something sinks when it isn't struggling against the water at all.
I closed the curtain so fast I nearly tore the rod off the wall.
I messaged the host that night, something light on the surface. Hey, kind of a random question, but what's actually up with the house rules? LOL. Mostly hoping for a cute story about a previous owner's superstition I could laugh about later. The reply came faster than I expected for 1 a.m. Please just follow them exactly as written. It really matters. I'll explain everything in person when you check out, I promise. You're almost through it. Not exactly reassuring, but it was also my last night, and some part of me decided the smartest move was to white-knuckle through 12 more hours rather than drive to a stranger's dark dock in the middle of the night to load my car. The last night, everything that could go slightly wrong did. A gust came through off the water hard enough to push the back bedroom curtain, which I'd clipped shut with a binder clip after the curtain rod incident, a few inches open at the bottom, just enough for a sliver of black water to show through. At almost the same moment, the porch light, which had been steady all week, flickered, dimmed, and went fully dark for what felt like 10 seconds before it caught and came back on, the way old bulbs sometimes do right before they die for good. And maybe 90 seconds after that, the hallway smoke detector gave 2 sharp chirps, close together, exactly the pattern Rule 6 had warned about. I didn't run. I want to say that clearly because I think it's the only reason I'm telling this story instead of someone else telling a very different one about me. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and nothing else, and I walked, fast and controlled, toward the front door, which meant passing one window that faced the water, just for a second, on the way through the living room. There was more than one of them this time. Standing at the edge of the dock and on the sand just past it, 3 or 4 shapes, low and motionless, right at the exact boundary where the porch light's glow gave out, and the dark started. None of them were inside that boundary. None of them were moving toward it either, just standing right at the line of it, the way you'd stand at the edge of a pool deciding whether the water's worth it. I made it to my car, locked every door, and called the number on the fridge with my hands shaking too hard to get the second digit right on the first try. A man answered, older, calm in a way that made it clear this was not the first time he'd taken this call. He told me to stay exactly where I was, headlights on, doors locked, and not to look directly at anything near the water if I could help it. When I asked him what was happening, what they were, he was quiet for a second and then said, "Just don't look at them, and they'll be gone by sunrise. They always are." That was the only answer he gave me that whole night, no matter how many times I asked it a different way. I sat in that car for almost 3 hours with the engine running for heat, watching the porch light hold steady the whole time, never once looking directly toward the dock again. By the time the sky started going pale gray over the water, whatever had been standing at the edge of that light was gone, and I never saw or heard it leave. The host met me in person the next morning, which the listing had never once mentioned he did, and refunded most of my stay without my asking. He told me just enough, standing in the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets, not quite looking at me the whole time. The cottage sits where an old fish-buying scow used to tie up, decades back, and the man who ran it drowned along with his 2 kids trying to get back to shore in a squall that came up too fast. Every owner since, as far as he knew, has kept the same 6 rules, passed down with the house like a deed. The porch light, so the dark house never looks like open water to something trying to find its way home. The water glass, so they're never given a reason to want for more than that. The curtains, so the place never looks too lit up and welcoming after a certain hour. The back door because it faces the old dock, and you never open that door to anyone or anything that knocks on it once the sun's down. He didn't know why it worked, only that it had, every year, for longer than he'd personally owned the place, as long as every single rule got followed exactly. I haven't booked another waterfront rental since, without reading every single line of the house rules twice. And I leave a porch light on, out of habit now, even at my own house, in a town nowhere near any water at all. I'm telling this now because a friend sent me a screenshot 2 weeks ago of that exact listing, relisted under a different name with new photos, the dock unmistakable in the background of one of them, and the house rules, word for word, still right there in the description for anyone scrolling fast enough to skip past them. If you've ever stayed somewhere with a list of rules that felt a little too specific to be quirky decor, I'd like to hear about it. And if you ever come across a waterfront listing on Whidbey Island with rules like the ones I just read you, please, for your own sake, just follow them. If something spooky has ever happened to you, or if you've got a story you want to share, send it in to stories@silasdarkwood.com. If you're still with me, there's another set of creepy stories on your screen, just waiting to give you another chill.